Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you, everyone, for being here in person. Thank you, everyone, joining us online. I'm delighted that you've joined us for this teach-in. I would like to do a couple of housekeeping things here at the very beginning. First, I'd like to introduce who's going to be speaking today and what the format of this is. And just a couple of caveats. So I'm Professor Katie Laatikainen. I'm a professor of political science and international relations. Also joining us is Professor Michael Christofferson from the Department of History. And online we have Professor Cristol, who will also be speaking. None of us, this is the caveat, none of us are experts on Russia or Ukraine. This is not our area of interest. Our purpose here today is to provide and spark conversation and try and uncover tools for trying to gain perspective about what's happening and what has happened over the past week. And so we're going to be looking at this from somewhat of our areas of expertise. So we're not experts on Russia or Ukraine, but you do have professors who have done research on international law and organization, on European history, and Professor Cristol is an expert on issues of international security. So we hope to have a really great discussion with you. I also would like to make a note of the changed format. Originally, we were expecting a small, intimate kind of classroom and a few people joining us on Zoom, but we had such big interest that we had to change this to a webinar format. So my apologies to those of you joining us on Zoom, that we're only going to be able to take questions from the floor here in the classroom. Last little bit of housekeeping is that this will be recorded. And so just be aware of that. Those of you in the room who will be asking questions, that we're going to be recording this and making this video. So I think that's it in terms of housekeeping. The order we're going to give preference to the historian. That seems to be the normal order of affairs. I'm going to speak on international law, and then Professor Cristol is going to be talking about sort of options for the U.S. in all of this. So I'm going to give the lead speak for about 10 minutes, and we're going to leave time for questions. So Professor Christofferson, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, like was just said, this is not an area in which I do research. And when any of us are in a situation like that, we rely on the research of others to help us understand topics. And I'd like to just point out, I put on the board 2 books here that kind of influenced my understanding of this topic, and from which I'm drawing quite a bit today. One by Annie Sarenko, Not 1 Inch, America, Russia, and the Making of Post-Cold War, the Post-Cold War Stalemate. That's mainly on NATO expansion. And Paul Danieri, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, but it's called Ukraine and Russia from Uncivilized Divorce to Uncivil War, that takes that history basically through 2014. So today I would like to provide elements of an answer to the question, why did Russia invade the Ukraine? British Secretary of State for Defense, Ben Wallace, offered one answer to this question, saying, I certainly think that Putin, is what he's doing is deeply irrational. I think he has gone full Tonto. Pinning the invasion on Putin's mental state is easy and perhaps comforting. It suggests that one does not need to look beyond Putin. He is the problem. There are no deeper issues involved. Without him there would have been no war. Remove him and the problem will go away. Can we stop that binging sound?
I can't.
It can't? Okay. To suggest that there are more profound reasons for the invasion, to seek to understand Putin's motives as a rational actor is not, I think, something that many of us are ready for, given the general revulsion with Russia's actions. There's an expression in French, tout comprendre, c'est tout pardonner. To understand all is to forgive all. And we're not in a forgiving mood. I too am appalled by the invasion, but the principal purpose of universities is not to vent anger, but rather to advance knowledge. So I'm going to proceed nonetheless to try to understand. So I'm going to suggest that the long-term origins of the war date back to the end of the Cold War and the collapse of European communism in 1989 to 91. First, some background. As many of you know, Between roughly 1947 and 1989, the United States and the Soviet Union faced off against each other in a Cold War. It was a competition between two social systems, democratic capitalism versus communist dictatorship, that took on many characteristics of war, except for the fact that the two superpowers never directly engaged each other in military conflict. Europe was divided between Western states that supported the United States and were allies in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, created in 1949, and Eastern states in the like of the Soviet Union and had communist dictatorships imposed upon them. In 1989, the Cold War came to an end when efforts initiated by Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to reform the failing communist system resulted in its collapse, first in Eastern Europe in 1989 and then the Soviet Union itself in 1991. I would like to focus on two developments that are essential context to the events we're experiencing now. First is the restructuring of European international relations after the Cold War's conclusion. Second, there is the 1991 dissolution of the Soviet Union itself into multiple independent states, including Russia and the Ukraine. Both developments will have long-term consequences that are part of the origins of the war that broke out this last week. When communism collapsed, the bipolar division of Europe that had profoundly structured its politics came to an end. What was going to replace it? Gorbachev spoke of building a common European home and suggested a pan-European security organization that would provide common security to all members on an equal basis. Ultimately, this path was not followed because the United States chose to expand NATO eastward, an option that was very attractive to small East European states wary of Russia. NATO expansion was taken very poorly by Russia, primarily because it was seen as undermining Russian security. The issue of NATO expansion first emerged in relationship to the reunification of Germany in 1990. This was the moment in which the Soviet Union had maximum leverage as its troops were occupying East Germany and its assent was needed for German unification to proceed. Early in the process, Gorbachev was told by American Secretary of State James Baker that if he allowed German unification, NATO would, quote, not shift 1 inch eastward from its present position. That's the title of this book, Not 1 Inch. Ultimately, though, the United States demanded that NATO's security guarantees extend to formerly communist East Germany, and Gorbachev agreed to it, to the great dismay of some of his advisors, after gaining the concession that NATO troops would not be allowed to be stationed in East Germany. In the 1990s, the US would commit to NATO expansion, beginning with the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. The Russians repeatedly stated their objections and claimed that expansion violated the spirit of the negotiations on German unification. In general, the US response was to dismiss Russian security concerns and try to buy Russian acquiescence with economic assistance and membership in partner organizations that had no real power. The US rebuffed Russian efforts to come up with compromises, such as giving new members statuses similar to that of East Germany, which would have put limits on NATO deployments in them. Behind closed doors, Russian President Boris Yeltsin was quite blunt with US President Bill Clinton, telling him in 1995, quote, I see nothing but humiliation for Russia if you proceed with NATO expansion. He added, how do you think it looks if one bloc continues to exist while the Warsaw Pact, which was the communist Cold War alliance, has been abolished? Russian fears about NATO were confirmed in their eyes by its Kosovo intervention in 1999 that was taken without UN approval. Yeltsin was livid, and opinion polls show that 93% of Russians disapproved of NATO's actions. NATO expansion was not on the table for the Ukraine in the 1990s, in part because even fervent advocates of NATO expansion recognized that the Ukraine was different. It had been part of the Soviet Union, and although that was also true of the Baltic states, the US had never recognized the Baltic states' annexation by the Soviet Union as legitimate, and they were substantially smaller. Ukraine, by contrast, was large, had important historical ties to Russia as well. Assistant Secretary of State Richard Holbrooke, who was a staunch supporter of NATO enlargement at the time, wrote that for these reasons in 1995, quote, Ukraine is the most delicate issue. He thought that there were three possible paths for it, which he identified as, quote, Poland, Belarus, or Finland during the Cold War. In other words, membership of NATO, alliance with Russia, or neutrality. He thought Ukraine still had, quote, a lot of sorting out to do before its geopolitical orientation was determined. By 2008, the United States had decided to support Ukraine's admission to NATO. Russia came out strongly against it, and France and Germany, who were sympathetic to Russian concerns, strongly resisted giving Ukraine a membership action plan, which would have put it on a clear path to NATO membership. A compromise was reached whereby NATO declined to give Ukraine a membership action plan, but declared at its April 2008 Budapest summit that Ukraine, as well as Georgia, will, quote, become members of NATO eventually. The compromise was arguably the worst of all possible outcomes for the Ukraine, as it alarmed Russia, but it did not give it any more security. Now, I want to turn your attention more briefly to a second development that will help us understand the origins of this war, and that's the collapse of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the Ukraine became independent following a referendum in which the Ukrainians overwhelmingly voted in favor of it. Yeltsin, who had engineered the dissolution of the Soviet Union to get rid of his rival Gorbachev, had hoped that the Commonwealth of Independent States that replaced the Soviet Union and brought together the former components of it, that this would keep the foreign, defense, and economic policies of Russia and Ukraine united, but this would not be the case. The independence of the Ukraine was a huge shock to Russia. The ambassador of the United States to the Soviet Union said as much when he reported to Washington that, quote, the most revolutionary event of 1991 for Russia may not be the collapse of communism, but the loss of something Russians of all political stripes think as a part of their own body politic, and near to the heart at that, Ukraine. Gorbachev, who was a descendant of both Russians and Ukrainians, did his utmost to prevent the two from parting ways. He told President Bush that the Ukraine and its current borders would be unstable if it broke away because those borders had been arbitrarily established. First, when the Bolsheviks added Kharkov and Donbass to it in a gerrymandering effort in the early 1920s, and then in 1954, when Soviet leader Khrushchev transferred the Crimea from Russia to the Ukraine. Clearly, not just Putin, but many members of the Russian elite before him had trouble seeing the Ukraine as having an independent identity. A telling exchange that shows how hard it was for some Russians to conceive of Ukrainian difference is as an exchange between James Baker, American Secretary of State, and Gorbachev's advisor, Alexander Yakovlev, in November 1991. Baker, who was concerned about the presence of nuclear missiles in Ukraine, wanted to know whether a war between Russia and Ukraine was possible and asked Yakovlev about it. Yakovlev could not see how that could happen, given that there were 12 million Russians in Ukraine, with many in mixed marriages, and he incredulously asked Baker, what sort of war would that be anyway? To which Baker responded, a normal war. In the years that followed Ukraine's independence, Russia tried its best to keep it within its orbit, both because of a sense that it was in some respects fundamentally Russian, and also because control of the Ukraine was seen as necessary for Russia to have a claim to great power status. Its entry into NATO was perceived as tantamount to losing it forever, and furthermore, a grave security threat. Ukraine itself was divided politically on its relationship with Russia. Eastern and southern Ukraine were generally in favor of closer relations with Russia, but Western Ukraine was in favor of more integration into Europe. Political success on a national level in Ukraine required satisfying both sides to some extent. Thus, politicians often switched back and forth, being pro-Russian or pro-European or pro-Western, depending on where the advantage was to be had. This became increasingly difficult, though, to play both sides after the 2008 NATO statement on Ukraine, and as conflict grew between democratization promoted by the United States and the authoritarian direction that Putin took Russia. The crisis came to a head in 2013 to 14. The immediate issue was Ukraine's relationship with the European Union. Ukraine's president, Viktor Yanukovych, was simultaneously negotiating trade deals with the EU and Russia, And these deals were incompatible with each other. Ukraine couldn't have both of them. In the end, Yanukovych chose the deal with Russia. His choice was met with protests in the Maidan Square in Kyiv. The protests soon shifted to contest Yanukovych's authoritarian anti-democratic politics. They grew in size and led to violent clashes. Ultimately, Yanukovych would flee the country and be replaced by the Ukrainian parliament. The protests had been supported by the United States, and Putin considered this Euromaidan revolution to be a coup d'etat engineered by the US. Evidently believing that he was losing the Ukraine, Putin decided to take what he could of it. The fall of Yanukovych was followed shortly thereafter by Russia's seizure of the Crimea and its sponsoring of a separatist movement in eastern Ukraine. And well over 10,000 people died in this conflict in eastern Ukraine, even before this most recent invasion of Ukraine began last week. This 2014 Russian intervention accelerated the Western shift of Ukraine that Russia had long feared. With neither the Crimea nor the separatist areas represented anymore in Ukraine's parliament, the pro-Russian current in Ukrainian politics was much diminished, and the rest of Ukraine, alienated by the Russian intervention in 2014, turned even more to the west. After a new trade deal with the EU, the Ukrainian economy oriented itself decisively westward. Given these trends, Putin likely concluded that without dramatic action, Russia was going to lose the Ukraine forever, and with it, Russia's bid to great power status. Putin once said that the collapse of the Soviet Empire was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He may very well think that this invasion of Russia is Russia's last best chance to restore its empire and its greatness. If so, I think he will fail, but his ambition is not that of a madman, but rather that of a certain Russian nationalism for which NATO enlargement and the fate of the Ukraine is rather more important than most Americans can imagine. That's it.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Professor Christofferson. I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction, and I have one point that I'm going to spend a lot of time elaborating, and that is about international law. And one of the things to say straight from the top is that international law and domestic law differ, right? And when we think about domestic law, we often engage in what John Fried calls the jailer concept of law. In a domestic law environment, we expect punishment for breaking law, and that involves enforcement. He also emphasizes how we tend to overlook how this notion of enforcement overlooks other sorts of punishment like fines. But those fines and imprisonment work in a domestic law context because individuals and firms are subject to the authority of the state. And this is the key difference between domestic and international law. Because in international relations, there is no higher authority than the state, right? They are the highest legal authority. And so therefore, the operation of international law depends in great measure on compliance rather than enforcement. And so this is the key point that I want you to be thinking about today. Compliance versus enforcement, right? Because states are the entities that make law, which is binding on themselves, and there's no higher authority than states that can enforce international law, states must be responsible to one another. That is why the normative system of international law, the norms of appropriate behavior are so critical. States agree to be bound by international law because they find the rules beneficial, right? It's in their self-interest. Enforcement in international law can occur, and states have created some mechanisms, some international organizations to assist in enforcement, but the expectation of multilateralism and international law is that of compliance, that states will comply with the laws that they themselves have created. So, what do I hope to do here? Oops, I'm going the wrong direction here, all right? What I want to do is talk about what does international law say about the use of force. We'll look at the UN Charter for that. And then what actions are available at the UN to address violations of international law. So I'm going to focus on those two things today, right? So first, there's a lot of text here. You can find this online. This is mostly text of the UN Charter. One of the things I want to say straight out is the UN Charter delegitimizes the use of force as a tool of national policy, right? It delegitimizes it. Article 2 of the UN Charter has lots of provisions. This is what describes the function or the principles of the UN. And what you will see is that a great deal of Article 2 talks about delegitimizing the use of force in the relations between states, right? So I'll just point to Article 2, which I'm not sure you can see there. It says all members, in order to ensure all of them, the rights and benefits resulting from membership shall fulfill in good faith the obligations assumed by them in accordance with the present charter. This shows us that this is a nod for compliance. States are responsible for complying with the provisions of the UN Charter. Paragraph 3, all members shall settle their international disputes by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered, right? So peaceful settlement of disputes. In the UN Charter, the chapter 6 of the UN Charter gives lots of possible mechanisms for states to resolve their disputes peacefully, but it's really putting the burdens on states. You must resolve your disputes peacefully, right? There's a chapter 6, if you read it, there's a lot of primacy of states engaging in negotiation, in fact-finding, in adjudication. There are international arbitration mechanisms, but basically states are being held responsible to resolve their disputes with one another. The big one, and the one that is getting lots of attention in all of the speeches that you might have heard the past week at the UN, is paragraph 4, Article 2, or it's often called Article 2, paragraph 4. All members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. So last week, if you happen to catch some of the televised debates in the UN Security Council, almost every single speaker mentioned Article 2, paragraph 4, territorial integrity and political independence of Ukraine, right? So this is the key normative dimension, that states should respect one another's territorial integrity and political independence. So what does the charter say about, so that's the principle, that states should act peacefully with one another. They should resolve their disputes peacefully. But what does the charter say about actually using force? The charter indicates very limited exceptions to this. In what instances can states use force against one another? The first is Article 51. This is in Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. It tells us that states have a kind of inherent right to self-defense. That is, if a state is attacked, it has the right to defend itself, right? It has the right to defend itself, but the use of force is dependent upon being attacked, right? And so there's a lot of legal discussion about preemption versus preventive wars. Can you act preventively or preemptively? Leaving that aside, the charter says that self-defense is a legitimate use of force by a state, right? The second area where we can talk about the use of force is under so-called Chapter 7, right, of the UN Charter. These are the collective security provisions. The other way in which states may use force is under Chapter 7 of the Charter. That is when the Security Council decides. And there are two articles that are really important here, Article 41 and Article 42 in Chapter 7 of the Charter. As you see here, Article 41 says that the Security Council may decide what measures not involving the use of armed force may be employed to give effect to its decisions. These may include partial or complete interruption of economic relations and of rail, sea, or air, postal, telegraphic, radio, or other means of communication, and for the severance of diplomatic relations, right? So these are actions short of war, but they are forceful. If the Security Council takes a decision under Chapter 7, all states are required to do this, right? It's not a choice. All states would be required. That's why it's called collective security. Article 42. Should the Security Council consider that the measures for these more peaceful measures of trying to deter have proved inadequate or proving inadequate, it may take such action by air, sea, or land forces that may be necessary to restore international peace or security. These can include demonstrations, blockades, or other operations by air, sea, or land forces by members of the United Nations. This is the strongest element of the UN Charter. The Security Council can use force against a member state, right? So again, this has to be approved by the Security Council. There are a few examples of the use of force by a member state's land, sea, or air forces against a member state. In 1950, the UN passed a resolution, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, identifying that North Korea was an aggressor against the South, and it authorized the use of force in the Korean War. A second example is in 1990 and 1991, when Iraq invaded Kuwait. The United Nations Security Council identified Iraq as an aggressor and authorized the use of force by UN member states to take action against Iraq, right? When the Security Council does this, it has to do three things. It has to, one, identify that there has been a breach of international peace and security. Two, it has to identify the aggressor. And three, it has to identify what kinds of actions will be taken, right? There are collective defense agreements under Chapter 8, but maybe we'll just move forward and continue. One of the challenges there, so if we think about, let me just go back for a second. If we think about this, both in terms of Chapter 6 and Chapter 7, what we see, let me go forward. What we see is that there have been efforts at Chapter 6, peaceful resolution of dispute. There have been two versions of the Minsk agreements between Ukraine and Russia to resolve the disputes. I don't want to go into all of the details of them. Both sides basically had different priorities regarding the 12 or so elements of the Minsk agreement. And so actually the Minsk agreements were basically not very useful in terms of peacefully resolving the situation of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine. There have been plenty of UN Security Council meetings on this, right? So again, this is part of peaceful resolution of disputes. I think within the past month alone, there have been 6 Security Council meetings on Ukraine and Russia. Even before this past week, they've been meeting since January 31st on a pretty frequent basis, right? So on Monday, January 21st, the Security Council was called into session as Russia recognized the Luhansk Democratic People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic. There was a meeting by the Security Council, and then again on Wednesday night, the Security Council was called into session just as, and it was one of the most remarkable televised elements of the Security Council as Russia commenced its invasion. The Security Council was meeting, and all of the members were talking about Russia should not do this. So it was very challenging. So one of the challenges, in terms of use of force, clearly we have now use of force. We have not resolved this dispute peacefully. What can be done with regard to Russia's use of force? Can there be any Chapter 7 kind of action happening here by the Security Council? Can the Security Council take action? One of the things we'll note is that there have been some sanctions that have been imposed, right? We've seen over the weekend that SWIFT, that there have been actions against two of the largest Russian banks, most closely associated with the Russian government and the military, and there have been limitations or limited access for Russian institutions to the SWIFT system of interbank communication. These sanctions notably have not been imposed by the Security Council. Why? Because Russia would obviously veto them, right? So this kind of Article 41 use of force short of military means, probably not going to happen, right? So there are sanctions, but these are not being imposed by the UN Security Council. Secondly, the Article 43 kinds of action, right? What about the Security Council authorizing the use of force? There was an effort on Saturday. The United States and Albania presented a draft resolution identifying Russia as an aggressor, calling on Russia to withdraw from Ukraine, from the areas that it was occupying, the actions it was taking. It was opened for co-sponsorship by the wider United Nations membership. 81 member states of the United Nations co-sponsored this resolution. On Friday, February 25th, by a vote of 11 in favor, 1 opposed, Russia, and 3 abstentions, China, India, and the United Arab Emirates, the resolution failed. So does it seem like actually this is over? The Security Council, the UN can do nothing. Not quite. There's one more possibility, and that's happening now. The United Nations has something called the Uniting for Peace resolution. It's been used roughly 10 times since 1950, first used in relation to the Korean conflict. What this does is it says if the Security Council is hamstrung, if it's deadlocked, then issues can be moved to the United Nations General Assembly. So on Saturday, the United Nations Security Council had a procedural vote. The veto does not apply here. They had a procedural vote to move this into the General Assembly. So today they are having the first meeting of an emergency session on Russia and Ukraine. It looks like the United States and Albania will reintroduce this resolution into the General Assembly and probably be voted on later this week. What are the outcomes? I'm sorry, I know you can't see this. You can look up Security Council report and you can look up Uniting for Peace and you'll find this document. What has happened in the past? Uniting for Peace resolutions have resulted in the use of force, right? So there was the use of force in Korea. The second example of Uniting for Peace meant the creation of the United Nations emergency forces that were deployed in the Middle East. Frequently, it does not involve the use of force, but it does identify aggression, right, by particular member states. The most recent use of this was about 2-3 decades ago. And so this is a fairly dramatic development within the UN. In the prior cases of emergency sessions, 4 of them were due to US vetoes, or US and UK and France. 1 was due to UK and France, that was the Suez Crisis. And then 6 have been due to Soviet or Russian vetoes, right? So these are pretty extraordinary, and there is this mechanism to deal with this. Whether something comes of this emergency session, we will have to determine, right? Or we'll have to wait and see. It'll be something to watch for this week. The last thing we could say, well, if Russia is an aggressor, maybe it shouldn't be actually acting in the UN, right? I mean, this seems to be a pretty dramatic element. Could Russia be suspended or expelled from the UN? But because it's a permanent member, the charter actually indicates that certain members are permanent members of the UN. So that becomes very difficult. There are no mechanisms for expelling a permanent member. However, right, if you watched the UN Security Council meeting last Wednesday, when the Ukrainian ambassador finally started to speak, he said, of course, the invasion had happened, and he put aside his remarks, and then he started to say strange things. And he was talking about 1991, and he raised this question about, he asked the Secretary General to circulate a legal understanding from 1991, right? So history is important here, right? Why was he doing that? Well, you've talked about, Professor Christofferson talked about Ukraine sort of being a creation of Russia, and certainly Putin says that. But it's important to note that Ukraine was a founding member of the United Nations, right? And what the Ukrainian ambassador is arguing is that actually Russia is not sitting in the Soviet seat. The Soviet seat is the permanent seat legitimately. Because in 1991, the Alma-Ata agreement dissolved the Soviet Union. Therefore, the Ukrainian ambassador is making the argument that the Russian Federation is not a continuing state, it's a successor state. So for instance, a continuing state would be India, right? India had a conflict with what became Bangladesh. India as a state continued. Bangladesh was a successor state of India, right? His argument is that the Russian Federation, because the Soviet Union was dissolved, is not a continuing state and doesn't deserve to sit in the chair of the Soviet chair, which is the permanent. So he's asking for the legal understanding about how Russia is sitting where it is. My understanding is that today this was brought up again at this emergency session. Is this going to go anywhere? No, it's not going to go anywhere. Why? Because two other Security Council, permanent members of the Security Council would also face problems, right? China, the People's Republic of China, is sitting in that state because recognition shifted from the nationalist Republic of China to the People's Republic of China. The other problem is, should Scotland decide for independence, it dissolves the United Kingdom, right? And so therefore, it raises all kinds of questions. So there's going to be a lot of resistance by other members of the Security Council to go down this path. But most legal scholars actually agree with the Ukrainian ambassador that this was a fast one, because had that had to be addressed in 1991, it would have had all kinds of charter implications, right? Okay, so what do we see? The UN is going to be deeply challenged in taking collective action on this issue. It's going to be deeply challenged. States are going to have to respond to this as states in the international system. And so again, states are responsible for complying with international law. All of the activities of the United Nations are not going to result in enforcement. What they do, however, is identify Russia as not being compliant with its obligations under international law and delegitimizing Russia, building political will to take action by states in the international system. The last thing I'll tell you with regard to international law is this: don't contribute to the further degradation of it. This past weekend, I've seen plenty of things on social media about young Russian conscripts being forced to say things online, and that stuff gets shared and shared and shared again. That is a violation of the Geneva Conventions. Don't add to this by sharing and reposting those things, right? It is a violation of international law. So I'll leave it there. I know I probably talked too long, so we'll hand it over to Professor Cristol.
Great, thank you. Can people hear me? Oh, okay. Excellent. Okay, I want to talk first about why this is such a consequential event, and then a bit about the US response and what we can and should do from here. You know, I've said to my students that, this could be the most consequential world event in their lifetime. The pandemic, maybe a bit more so. And the reality is 9/11 might not be as consequential. And also a lot of the students weren't born yet, which is depressing in its own way for me. But why? Well, what Putin has done in the situation with Ukraine is mount an assault not only on the rules-based international order that has existed since the end of World War II, but is also an assault on the state system itself, right? And marks a return to the sort of wars of empire and conquest that we had, not just in the first half of the last century, but really for the centuries prior. And he has said as much in his speeches last week, and even going back years, that that he is hoping to reestablish the Russian Empire of old. And he has alluded not only to Ukraine, but even to the Baltics. And in the speech that was, the statement that was erroneously posted on Russian state media last night or early this morning, even talks about, absorbing Belarus as well, which would be granted a bit easier. And I think that it is also important to note a sort of different history and context here, which is that of increasing violations of international norms that we've seen over the last 15 years. And I'm talking about the continued incursions into the Alaskan and Canadian air defense identification zones, ordering US fishermen out of the exclusive economic zone in the Alaskan area. This was summer before last. In terms of shutting down GPS in Scandinavian countries, violating Finnish airspace, violating South Korean airspace, unsafe passes over US ships, NATO ships, and planes, last week passing 5 feet from a plane in flight, the 2008 invasion of Georgia and creeping annexation there as well. In addition, of course, to the well-documented cyber attacks, not only on the US, but around the world. A chemical weapons attack in the United Kingdom, a NATO country, a few years ago. The revelation that that same team blew up a Bulgarian ammunition depot inside Bulgaria. We could list this endlessly. Sometimes I do. But what I think is important to note is that what we've seen over the last many years is a continuous effort to push against established global norms, see what he can get away with, and he's gotten away with a lot, and then to push a bit further. But what's different in this context, and why I think it's led to the response that it has, is that it goes up against the most sort of fundamental norm of the UN system and international order that Professor Laatikainen was talking about. It's something that is, since 1945, extraordinarily rare. The idea that one state is invading and annexing another state to take it. We saw it in 1991. We saw it in the Indonesian invasion and annexation of East Timor, before my lifetime. Both of those were reversed. Granted, it took 30 years in the case of East Timor. And this invasion, which really started in 2014 and wasn't pushed back on then. And so I think that that is really, I think, also a key bit of context as well. Now, how have we handled this? I am very unaccustomed to being complimentary of any administration's foreign policy. It is definitely out of my comfort zone. Usually I just criticize and have the luxury of not having to offer any of my own solutions. But this is a case where I think the administration has gotten this exactly right, which is, I think, particularly remarkable, given that it's the uniqueness of the situation. I think the strategic use of releasing intelligence to throw Putin and his regime off balance, to take away any sort of element of surprise. Now, you don't really have a surprise land invasion. That's not really a thing that exists, but in terms of a false flag attack to sort of prepare the ground for that. In terms of the close coordination with allies has been really remarkable. It actually takes quite a lot of work to maintain alliances, to maintain channels of communication in the best of times. And the administration's team in place is really ideal for this. You have a lot of transatlanticists who over their careers have really emphasized the importance of working with our European and East Asian partners, and of course, Australia and New Zealand as well. So I think that has gone remarkably well. Moving troops to the NATO border is something that should be expected. I'm glad that we are doing it and continuing to do it. We've been running continuous air patrols along the NATO border. And what you've seen over the last few days is not just the imposition of pretty remarkable level of sanctions so quickly, but a day-by-day escalation of consequences, including today, the preventing Russia from operating in US dollars, from not allowing their Federal Reserve to do that, which is especially harmful to an oil-based economy. Because international transactions in oil are dollar denominated. And I think we've shown a pretty good willingness to take some risks. It's not risk-free to arm Ukraine. It's not risk-free to announce those arms deliveries. Obviously not the location and time and place, but to actually continue to do this. Right, it's not risk-free, and so, but I think you have to be willing to take risks when the other side is willing to has been willing to for a long time. But we've also shown that we're not going to take Putin's bait. Right, yesterday he raised the alert level of his nuclear forces. Strategic Command, U.S. Strategic Command earlier today confirmed that we are not going to be doing the same thing. Right, that makes a lot of sense. It deprives Putin of the ability of saying, well, look at what they're doing too. Now we have to escalate further. And I think it helps perhaps to calm folks in the US. We don't really need to do that other than to send a message. And I don't think it's a message that needs sending right now. And haven't been willing to do anything sort of insane, right? Like create a no-fly zone, which some people in the Twitterverse and some smart people have advocated. But a no-fly zone would mean that we are essentially means we are entering the conflict, right? That would mean we have to shoot down Russian planes. It means we'd have to shoot down shoot from above Russian air defense systems. And, that is a degree of risk and uncertainty that I think should make all of us uncomfortable. But we cannot allow Putin to win in Ukraine, right? We can't allow the continuous erosion of norms when it comes down to what kind of world do we all want to live in, right? Do we want to live in the world of empires that we left behind? Do we want to live in an age where territorial aggrandizement is acceptable? And I don't think that any of us do, and I don't think that any of us should. And I think one thing we have to keep in mind with all of this, because you also will hear, I'm surprised we haven't heard it more, frankly, already, the idea that any increased amount of US or NATO involvement will somehow lead to nuclear war. Well, look, we should be worried about this. Obviously, the risk of that is greater today than it was a month ago. But, Putin, no one that I know who's an expert in this thinks that Putin is suicidal. And he knows, as well as we do, that we, France, and the United Kingdom are all nuclear powers. And so I think that if we allow the sort of nuclear brinksmanship that he appears to want to play to continue, so where does it end? Right? There is no reason to think it would end with Ukraine. I think we need to make very clear as well that there will be severe consequences if President Zelensky or his family are harmed. That would be an additional norm violation to a pretty remarkable one. And I think that there are things we can do if he does that. We can continue to disrupt Russians' ability to lead sort of 21st century lives. And yes, I mean people who are not connected to Putin necessarily, but war is ultimately about achieving a political end, breaking the other side's will to fight. And if we can put enough pressure on ideally just the Russian government, but if need be beyond that, to from pressure from above, I think it needs to be done. That said, and I'll end with this, we also need to make clear that any consequences that are put into place will be withdrawn once Russia withdraws and there's a return to a previous status quo. I'm not sure if that means the status quo from, certainly doesn't mean from 2 weeks ago, but I'm not sure if that means the status quo from 6 months ago or from 2013. I'm glad that I don't have to be the one to figure that out. But I think that in case of sanctions that have a specific goal that will clearly be reversed, I think we should not shy away from, and hopefully it continues. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you. All right, so of course you give an academic an inch and we take a mile, so we all spoke longer than 10 minutes. But for those of you in the room, if you have questions or comments that you would like to share, we would love to hear from you. That's the whole point of a teach-in. Yes, Pastor.
So I have I have two questions. Hopefully they're quick. Well, one, is there any scenario, like, is there any scenario where troops from NATO forces would join Ukraine, or would that escalate to nuclear conflict? And then second question is, I haven't, like, I don't much, but from my reading, like news when I was just a little bit at the games, Putin seems very careful keeping power, staying in power, and this war is very unpopular in Russia. So it seems like I get that Putin is like not a madman and is like, and this is like a plan to rebuild Russian dominance and empire, but it seems contradictory to his intelligence ability, his ability to intelligently and horrifically stay in power through many means that were very careful. I mean, like wrong, he was, even though he was dictator, was very popular in all the elections. Okay.
So just to make sure.
Yeah, I'm done.
Okay, all right. So just to repeat for those of you who might not have heard, that his two questions are: what is there any scenario where NATO troops may intervene in Ukraine? And then I think the second question, it went on, but I think the question is, Putin has been very interested in keeping power. What are the implications of the protests for his ability to remain in power, given at least some unpopularity of this? So
to address the second one.
Okay, so why don't you do that?
Yeah, just the question of
The first one.
Putin's popularity in relationship to this intervention. I think the jury's still out as to, well, one, what's going to happen with the intervention, and two, how Russian society is reacting to it. One thing is clear: the annexation of the Crimea was popular in Russia. That there are many people who feel these parts of the Ukraine should be part of Russia. Now, on the other hand, I think a lot of Russians are reacting a lot like Gorbachev's advisor reacted in 1991, which is to say, how can we go to war over these issues if they are our brothers, actually? So I think maybe Putin, thought that if it went easily, if the Ukrainian resistance collapsed quickly, if this was relatively bloodless and he was able to achieve his objectives, it would be popular and it improved his standing in the country. But of course, the longer it goes on, the more bloody it is. I think the more it's going to hurt him politically. But you have to understand, I mean, there are a lot of Russians who believe that at least part of the Ukraine should be part of Russia, and he can use that to his advantage.
And I'll just hop in. I know Professor Cristol will want to do this as well on the first question. Look, NATO is a collective defense organization. That means that member states agree to respond when a member has been attacked. Ukraine is not a member, right? There's discussions about membership for Ukraine, as we heard, but it's not a member. Now, as Professor Cristol said, there is the movement of troops along the border of NATO. If there is some sort of inadvertent accident which involves NATO, then that can trigger, right, a response by NATO. NATO has acted out of area in a way which is actually very contested. So NATO bombing in response to Serbia and Kosovo was not approved by the United States. So if we go through all of those things for the use of force, that was an illegal use of force by NATO. And so there is part of the reaction, I think that Professor Christofferson was talking about, the West has also used force illegally. The second Iraq war was an illegal use of force. It wasn't approved by the Security Council, and the United States have not been attacked by Iraq, right? So this is not the first time that this has happened. But if NATO troops are attacked even inadvertently, that I think it's our help. What do you think, Professor Cristol?
I mean, I think that it is almost impossible to imagine a scenario in which NATO intentionally enters this conflict. As Professor Laatikainen said, the danger is an inadvertent escalation due to an accident. Now, as I've said, my concern in general has been Putin's increasing willingness to take risks. And with each risk, any sort of incident, there's the potential for things to go wrong. But I would also say, so I don't think we should get involved in that way. I think we're doing exactly the right thing to make it clear that if Russia crosses the NATO border, the consequences will be severe. It is worth mentioning one key data point, which is that in Syria, just a few years ago, the US accidentally bombed and killed between, the measurements vary, I've actually been working on this the last couple of days, between 80 and 200 Russian troops in Syria. And not only are we all still alive, my guess is many people in the room or Zoom room didn't even know it had happened. And so, not every accident is going to lead to nuclear war, and not every war is going to lead to a nuclear war. But we have to, this is not something we should be involved in on the ground. And the administration has been right from day one to say that we would not be there on the ground.
Yes, here. So you mentioned that the Security Council may take it to General Assembly, and you also mentioned it may take a while to make a decision. So before, for example, let's have a scenario: General Assembly makes a decision, but Ukraine can't resist anymore. Is there any backup plan where the world can help Ukraine to save its borders, or it is decided as the situation escalates?
Right. So again, the UN is not the world's police, right? So hopefully that is the point that came through. However, other states can do things, right? So the European Union has actually taken some decisions to supply military aid. Individual states have also agreed to supply military material and support to Ukraine. So states can do that, right? They're free to do that, and some are doing that. If the question is, what happens with this? What happens with this emergency session? Some emergency sessions go on for decades, right? So that's the other thing. So I'm not, the point of this emergency session is not that it's going to lead to the use of force. It has rarely, in 2 occasions, have actual troops been deployed under an emergency session resolution. Only in 2 of the 10. And there's a dispute about how many there actually are for the Uniting for Peace, but only in 2 instances. And one was a peacekeeping troop and not a peace enforcement troop. Or it was a peace enforcement operation. So, you know, sometimes there's a ruling. So one of the results was a ruling by the International Court of Justice about the legality of the separation wall between Palestinians and Israelis. So that's not the use of force at all, but it's about how legitimate are the actions being taken. So again, a lot of this is about building the political will to take action. And it's really states that are responsible for enforcing international law in this self-help system. Professor Cristol, do you have anything to say that?
No, I'll go to the next one.
There's someone way in the back of the room, right there, at the very back.
My question involves something I just read this morning. Does the fact that Switzerland, which has historically been neutral, has decided to freeze Russian assets come into play, and how would it?
Yeah, Switzerland's important in global economic affairs, right? I mean, so this is really important. The International Bank of Settlements is in Switzerland, so it's going to have a major economic impact. Foreign Affairs has a piece today talking about this is no longer about deterrence anymore, it's about economic attrition, right? And so hastening what the first questioner asked about, you know, undermining support for Putin's regime. So again, I don't think things are going to happen quickly, but it's really important. Another example of how this is upending international affairs. I mean, I do work on the Nordic countries. For the first time well, for almost 200 years for Sweden, and since 1939 for Finland, both Finland and Sweden that have been neutral countries, they're talking about NATO membership in a serious way. It's above 50% in Sweden who are in favor of joining NATO. In the last report in Finland is slightly lower, but these 2 long-term neutral countries are beginning to think about NATO membership. So the neutrals don't feel the need to be as neutral any longer.
And I think, you know, the case, the Switzerland thing this morning, I think really hammers home and emphasizes how rare it is that you have near universal global agreement about anything in international politics, right? That what Russia is doing is wrong, and everyone agrees, even states that you might not expect to agree. That, you know, Switzerland, I think, is taking this position similar to when it joined the United Nations. At the time Switzerland joined the UN, it was the last one to do so, although there have been ones since, because who are you neutral from if everyone is on board? And it also shows the sort of starkness of the sort of right and wrong element here. And it's something that, in all honesty, it's almost hard to remember the last time such a thing took place, where it was just such a clear-cut black and white case of right and wrong.
Yes, in the blue.
Yes, I was wondering, in response to something that I read about basically Germany finally agreeing to supply Ukraine with weapons to defend against Russia. So I was wondering about, like, how likely is that to lead to, like, greater involvement from other countries in Europe in the conflict?
As I understand it, it's the EU that's going to be supplying weapons. What Germany did is it agreed to increase defense spending to at least 2% of GDP, which it has not done. And so this is, again, something that the US has been demanding of partners for a long time, predating Trump, but for a long time.
They also said that they would provide, I think, Stinger missiles and anti-tank weapons, which is a very significant move on Germany's part, because Germany has been very, although they make a lot of weapons, very hesitant with regard to its own involvement abroad because of its history in World War II. and was even saying just a few weeks ago, or the line was basically, we don't want our weapons being used against Russia because, well, our weapons were used against Russia between 1941 and 1945 and killed several million Russians and Ukrainians for that matter. So they do not want to be involved in it that way. So it's a really important change, I think, in Germany's kind of understanding of its role in the world.
Especially with the social democratic chancellor, right? I mean,
Right. The
that's
Social
really,
Democrats have been even more.
but it is important that the EU has decided to get on board with this too, right? Because common security and defense policy has been understood to be sort of alternative security, that NATO sort of did that stuff and the EU sort of does alternative sort of threats to security. But the EU has actually taken a pretty strong position on this too. So it's changing the dynamics of European security. Second one.
With the advancement of nuclear defense technology, do you guys believe that the idea of mutually assured destruction has been eroded? And if so, do you believe that's a contributing factor to Putin's constant threats about nuclear arms?
I think
There-
that's the one for Professor Cristol.
Yeah, I mean, no. I mean, that's the short answer. No, I don't think that that's been eroded. First of all, we have no defense against nuclear weapons. We just don't. The concern that comes up a bit as it pertains to the use of nuclear weapons and Russian nuclear strategy, which is a bit controversial, although this controversy has become a bit more salient in the last week, is the idea that Russia's strategy is called escalate to de-escalate. The idea that they might use a low yield nuclear weapon, something as low as maybe 5 kilotons, which is about 1/3 the Hiroshima bomb, as a way to demonstrate essentially that they are willing to use nuclear weapons, to use even bigger ones, to essentially force the other side to back down. There's a lot of controversy about that. There's a lot of controversy about in what circumstance would they do that? Would they use it, for example, in this case, in Ukraine, or would they do it over the Pacific Ocean, right? Just to show that they're willing to violate the norm that has existed for decades of essentially not testing nuclear weapons or using them. I guess we're going to find out the answer to that in the near future. I don't think it is likely that they will do that, but that is a known possibility in general that Russia might consider under particular circumstances. The report on this strategy, the context was an invasion of NATO. And that makes a lot more sense in that context than in this context.
The whole threat that was offered last week, when Putin mentioned sort of response, if NATO gets involved, that there will be consequences that you've never experienced before. This is what they're asking. I mean, will this be a sort of tactical use of nuclear weapons? I think this is kind of the conversation that Professor Cristol is in. That's the thing that we're all really wondering. I think we might have time for a couple more questions here.
Yeah, recently there's been a lot of comparisons being drawn between Russia and Ukraine and China and Taiwan, and the possibility of invasion of Taiwan by China. And while that possibility may not be, these two situations may not be fungible, I'm curious about how these two regional issues might intersect. So I have two questions. What are the implications of sanctions? What might be the implication of sanctions on the relationship between Russia and China? And given the fact that the Biden administration has prioritized China in its foreign policy, how might this event affect the United States' foreign policy priorities?
I can speak to the first question, and I'll let maybe Professor Cristol speak to the second. Actually, I'm really struck by one of the first things you said, like the comparison between China, Taiwan, and Russia, Ukraine. So the issue of Taiwan and People's Republic of China is that China was never dissolved. It was a question of which government was recognized as the legitimate representative of China, right? So in that regard, Chinese use of force against Taiwan would not be seen in the same way because it is not the use of force against a sovereign state in international affairs, right? It would be a use of force, internal use of force, right? Which it can be bad in all kinds of ways, but they're not exactly the same kind of thing. Wait, that wasn't your question, right?
Maybe I think I have something. One major difference, I mean, the two are obviously, they're connections, but is Biden, for example, was very, very clear from the beginning of this. We will not be moving troops into Ukraine. We will not be fighting there. The policy of the United States towards Taiwan is one of strategic ambiguity. We will not say whether or not we will defend Taiwan. So in a sense, China always has to keep in mind that we might actually, fight over Taiwan. And so this makes it, much riskier for them to engage. Now, what China maybe would be looking at with all regard to all this is how much resistance the United States put up to what Russia's doing now. Because if they thought that we just rolled over, maybe they would think, well, that indicates that the U.S. has no appetite for war and will not come to the defense of Taiwan. So I think those are some of the calculations. With regard to Russia and Chinese relations, it appears that Russia is turning economically towards China. People went to the Olympics, that they're developing these ties, that they're building a kind of common alliance along their, with their defense of autocratic government. So it seems that this whole thing is bringing the two together. On the other hand, China is not really too keen on the infringement of sovereignty of independent states because that's what happened to it time and time again in the 19th century. So it's a major kind of concern for them. So where they will fall in the end is hard to say.
It's also, this whole issue of SWIFT and the communications of payments. The Chinese have their own system, right? And so one of the things that may happen is that actually keeping Russia out of SWIFT may actually create incentives to strengthen alternatives to Western processes and institutions that the US and the West can control.
Just a very quick 2 points. Just on the China-Taiwan, I agree with everything that was said. I would just add that it is also our policy is strategic ambiguity, but part of that is that we say we are committed to the defense of Taiwan. We just don't say what that means, or if we would literally defend it in the event of a conflict. So people may have seen this morning, the administration said they were sending over a delegation of former defense officials and former cabinet secretaries to Taiwan. And part of that is, we like to have people like that there because then it increases the cost for China to do anything at the moment. In terms of foreign policy priorities, this is an area where I think, the Trump administration got it exactly right in their national security strategy when they shifted the emphasis from the war on terror into great power conflict. And in the national security strategy, it is itself is unclear who is the bigger threat, Russia or China. I can tell you though that within the Defense Department, the scenario that is often debated in terms of how we would react is what would happen if there was a Russian invasion somewhere in Europe and simultaneously a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. What would we do in the moment? Because we do not have the resources to fight both of those wars at once. And that's something that, I think is unsettled, or at least I don't know what the outcome of those debates have been.
Ladies and gentlemen, our time is well past what we were allowed. I will just tell you. This is one of those times. The folks on the news asked us, have you had teach-ins before? We have had teach-ins before. The only other one that I was directly involved with was after 9/11, right? Those are times when decisions are taken that shape the next decade or 2 decades. So use all the tools at your disposal, pay attention, and remain engaged. Thank you for coming.